When we pay a substantial cost for something, we want to know that the cost was worth something, that we got something in exchange for the cost. And we can reflect on something that we discussed in relation to the First World War to set up this discussion that we're going to have. And if you look at the second column down, we are reminded that during the First World War, France took casualties of 76%. More than 3 out of 4 men who went into combat in the First World War became a casualty of some kind, dead, wounded, missing, prisoner. If you look down below, beneath where it says Central Powers, we see that Germany took casualties of almost 65%. And of course, these are rough estimates, but they're pretty close to being right, I think. 65%. So of every 100 Germans who go into the war, about 65 of them, so a large majority, become a casualty of some kind. And when nations experience these kinds of costs, I think people want to be able to say that the costs were worth something, that something was gained in exchange. It's interesting that France comes out on the winning side of the First World War. But the psychological and the physical and the emotional costs were so great that it appears that France never really recovered psychologically from that defeat. And this is one of the things that I think helps to explain the very rapid defeat of France at the beginning of the Second World War. In terms of military power, there's no reason why France should have collapsed so quickly. It seems that the fundamental problem was a psychological collapse, and I think that that collapse is related to the catastrophic casualty rate of the First World War. That even though France comes out on the winning side, the benefits of coming out on the winning side don't seem to compensate the tremendous costs. On the other side, we have Adolf Hitler down below, who we remember was a brave soldier during the First World War. And he takes that sense of loss. His country loses the war, 65% casualties. It seems that, whenever you go out for walks, you can see veterans missing legs, you can see women with children, and you can perhaps assume that the husband was lost in the war. That Hitler takes that sense of loss and uses it as a kind of energy to motivate himself and others to fight the war again. So in one case, the incredible loss leads to a kind of psychological collapse. In the other case, the loss leads to a sense of rage. When we come to the Vietnam War, where the losses are in the upper 50,000s, 57, 58,000. The country wants to know that something was gained in exchange for that loss. And I think that this is what has been one of the great challenges for the United States since the Vietnam War. What did the United States get in exchange for all of those lost lives? Not only the 58,000 dead, but the many who were wounded and the many who continue to live with the consequences of the war psychologically, spiritually, and physically from wounds that they acquired during the war. And so I will tell you about a person I know who was a JBU student, and he was a student at John Brown University during the 1960s. He stops being a student at JBU and he becomes a Marine pilot, a helicopter pilot, and he goes to Vietnam. And he fights in Vietnam and he sees a lot of combat. The helicopters that he is on, 3 of them are shot down. So imagine that. Imagine being in a helicopter, being shot down once, twice, 3 times. He's in a country where the soldiers who are actually from South Vietnam, that is the anti-communist South Vietnamese soldiers. Many of them are not reliable. You're not sure that you can really trust these South Vietnamese allies. The Koreans, certainly. The Australians, yes. The New Zealanders, yes. But what about the South Vietnamese soldiers? Some Vietnam veterans will say the South Vietnamese soldiers, at least some of them, were very courageous and fought very, very well. But it seems that most Vietnam veterans will say that our South Vietnamese allies were not reliable. They were not courageous. They did not seem invested in fighting for their own country. And that inevitably leads to the question then, well, if they're not going to fight ferociously for their own country, why should I? Imagine the toll that that takes on an 18, a 19, a 20-year-old. And then put next to that the fact that despite that, these soldiers did fight ferociously. They fight to survive. They fight for the person next to them. They fight for a sense of pride. But are they really fighting for this place? It's difficult to fight for this place if the people who actually live here, if many of them anyway, don't seem to be devoted to fighting for their cause. The North Vietnamese army, they seem to be devoted to their cause. The Viet Cong seem to be devoted to their cause. It seems that the South Vietnamese allies, at least some of them, don't appear to be devoted to the cause. And then what happens when these beautiful children don't look like beautiful children, but they look like potential enemies? You'll notice the little boy there is reaching back. It appears that he's reaching back, and you don't know why. Is it just an itch? Is he reaching back for something? The boy on the bike, you see the bag. You don't know what's in the bag. Perhaps there's bread in the bag. Perhaps there's a hand grenade in the bag. Perhaps the boy, once you walk by, he'll stop his bike, turn around, and throw a hand grenade. Or perhaps he is taking hand grenades to Viet Cong in the next village. A lot of Vietnam veterans will say that even young children came to be seen as potential enemies because a 10-year-old boy could run up to the truck and toss a grenade into the back of the truck. I mean, imagine the psychological toll that this takes on you. American soldiers don't face this fighting the Germans. They don't face this fighting the Italians early in the Second World War. In this photo is the JBU student that I'm talking about. I won't say which person it is, but as he and I discussed this photo, he pointed out a few of these guys here who did not survive the war. And you come home and you think about the friends you lost in the war, the comrades you lost in the war, and you want to be able to give a reason for it. What did we gain in exchange for the loss? Now this student, he finished his year in Vietnam and then he came back to JBU. And I asked him, gosh, what was that like to go from being a student to fighting in Vietnam to getting shot down multiple times to being involved in a lot of combat and then coming back to quiet JBU? What was that like? And like a lot of combat veterans, he didn't have a lot to say, but one thing he did say was that he realized that things that bothered him before didn't bother him now. I asked him if he saw this photograph, which was published in JBU's yearbook, 1972. I have to say I was surprised to see this photograph and somewhat disappointed as well, because the photograph tells a story. The photograph seems to tell a story of an external force, an American force that goes into Vietnam, that brutalizes the people, that tramples on the people. You'll notice the fellow in the hat, it appears that he's South Vietnamese, but the guy holding the gun, the pistol there, is an American. And the photo certainly doesn't tell a positive story. It doesn't tell the story of, what motivated the interest in Vietnam in the first place. And the desire was not to go to a small, poor country and brutalize the people. The desire was not to go to Vietnam and just to run wild. The desire was to prevent the spread of communism, which had proven itself an oppressive political system. And what we don't have is a photograph of the many Americans and others who went to Vietnam not to fight, but to build schools, to build bridges, to provide social services, to provide medical services. So imagine what it's like to be a young soldier who goes to Vietnam for whatever reason, drafted, volunteer, sense of patriotism. You experience this very difficult war, and you come home, and even at a pretty conservative place like John Brown, this is the photograph that you get in the yearbook. That must be very difficult. Well, despite the difficulties of the moment, you have, the optimism that you sometimes get among the young, even those who are in Vietnam. And these excerpts here come from letters that I have written by a soldier in Vietnam in 1969. We won't stop to read this, but in this one part of the letter, the soldier refers to the landing on the moon. And he says the guys are sitting around talking about what's happening up on the moon, and maybe we could take our next R&R, our next rest and recreation up on the moon, obviously joking. But you get this from Vietnam veterans. You read their memoirs, you read their letters, and there they are in Vietnam, but they still read about this incredible achievement of, the space program, of landing men on the moon, and there's a sense of national pride that comes with that. Here we have a quote from the same soldier in a different letter, and if you look down here, he says, if I can do this, that is, if I can be a Marine for 2 years, I will be proud to come home and join, I can't make out that word, join the, I can't see exactly what that word says, as being a normal citizen of the greatest country on the face of the earth. And so you get that, you get the idea that he wants to come home and rejoin American society, what he calls the greatest country on the face of the earth. He says, I didn't ask for this, so apparently he was drafted, but for 2 years I might as well make all I can out of it. And then at the bottom of that sheet there we have the very famous image of the Marines on Iwo Jima. Well, I don't know where things ended up for this Marine, or if the Marine is alive today. But if the Marine is alive today, perhaps he has visited the Vietnam Memorial. And so what I want to do is just relate some things to you of a couple visits that I took to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. The first time was in the early fall of 2014, and I only spent about 90 minutes there. And what I saw is what you often see, people taking photographs or making sketches of particular names, obviously interacting with particular names. This name here, Charles Waters, he was a chaplain who did not have to go out on patrol with soldiers, but he did. And on one occasion, he was killed when the unit he was with was ambushed. At the Vietnam Memorial, you see people will leave things. They leave photographs, they leave flags, they leave bottles of beer, they leave notes and letters, and so on. This fellow here, the man with the hands on his hips, his story was that he was at Khe Sanh as a Marine. There was a family emergency, and so he went home. And the Marine who took his place was killed not long after. And this fellow apparently knew that Marine's name, but had not committed it to memory. He just moved on with his life. But as time went by, he wondered about this Marine, and he had a name in his mind, something like Centinela. But he didn't know if that was the Marine's first name. He didn't know if it was his last name. He didn't know if it was a nickname. He didn't really even know if he had actually just invented the name himself. So there he was, looking at the part of the wall related chronologically to his service in Vietnam, trying to find a name that looked familiar, and he never found it. And that was a powerful experience. This is a common scene at the Vietnam Memorial. as Vietnam veterans come and touch the wall, touch the names that they're there to see. This fellow here, after he spent time looking at the wall this way, went back to the very beginning of the wall, and he slowly swept his hand over the entire length of the wall. Very slow process. And you see those kinds of things at the Vietnam Memorial. I was able to go back to the Vietnam Memorial in May of 2016 and spent 2.5 days there and met many people. The Vietnam veteran on the right, his father, a World War II veteran, on the left. Another World War II veteran had come by. As always, people left things, and you'll notice on the left there's an Australian flag. And then what I've put on the right is up at the top right, there's a patch from Australian forces in Vietnam. Down below is a patch from Australian forces in Iraq. And I don't think most Americans know that the one country that has been on the side of the United States in every single conflict since the First World War is Australia. Australia and the U.S. were on the same side in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And in that sense, Australia has been the United States' most consistent and most loyal ally in these various conflicts. That gets to another theme, something we've mentioned already, that the United States, although we think of the Vietnam War as an American war, the United States had a number of allies. South Koreans were in South Vietnam fighting the Vietnamese. And next to the United States and the South Vietnamese forces, the South Koreans had the largest force. There were Thai soldiers from Thailand in Vietnam. There were Australians, a small number of New Zealanders, and then the ARVNs, that is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. So we think of it primarily as an American war, but there were other countries that were there, once again involved in this Cold War project of stopping the spread of communism. Just another story going back to the wall. This fellow here was a man of very few words, but those of us who had spent some time at the wall could tell that he was looking for a name. His pronunciation was difficult to understand, this fellow, and so he said he was looking for a name that sounded like Corey, Carey, etc. And so we went to the books and the different sites to try to find the name, and we couldn't find it. But he just sort of very persistently just looked down the wall, and he eventually found that name, and you can see that K-A-H-R-E is Carey, I guess it would be. He pronounced it as Corey. But in any event, once he found the name, we were able to talk a bit about that. Some of the lingering anger among some veterans. A veteran, I saw him put this patch down, and I asked him if he'd be interested in telling me about his thoughts, and he was not interested. But then I looked at the patch, and he says, "I'll forgive Jane Fonda when Jews forgive Hitler." That's obviously a statement of anger. And just very briefly, Jane Fonda was a celebrity and remained a celebrity, but she was a celebrity during the Vietnam War. And she went to North Vietnam, and she encouraged the North Vietnamese fighters, even encouraged the North Vietnamese fighters to shoot down American planes, and many people saw this as an act of treason. And among Vietnam veterans, Jane Fonda has come to symbolize sort of the extreme anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. As the Vietnam War goes on, you could understand why more and more people will turn against the war and will want to bring the war to an end. I think it's more difficult to understand somebody actually going to the side of the enemy force and encouraging them even to shoot down planes from your own side, but this was one of the elements of the war. Just the kinds of scenes you see at the wall. This lady's named Maureen, And she told me the story of her brother who was killed in Vietnam. She was in junior high school. The principal came to her classroom and called her out, and she said as soon as the principal came and called her out of class, she knew that something had happened. The principal did not tell her what, but when she got home, she found out. And it was a very powerful story, listening to her tell that. After all of these decades, still it was very powerful and moving for her. This fellow here, interestingly, said to me as we talked that he wanted to make a confession. And his confession, he apparently feels some guilt over this. He was a young soldier, and one night in his small tent was the medic with the group that he was with. And as was normal in the Vietnam War, the medic was called simply Doc, short for doctor. And this veteran never learned Doc's real name. And Doc was eventually killed in the war. And since you had a lot of this stuff going on in the war, you just kind of forget it and move on. But as time went by, as the years went by, this veteran, wondered what was Doc's real name. And so he came to the wall, and this is similar to the earlier story I told you. He came to the wall, went to the part of the wall associated with his time of service, just trying to find any name that looked familiar. And what he wanted to confess was this sense of guilt that he had never learned Doc's real name. And I told him, I said, look, I've talked to many veterans, and nicknames were common, and people remembered nicknames, but they, often didn't learn real names, and he knows that that's true. But still, there's this sense, this nagging sense that he should have learned Doc's name, and so that's just something that he has to live with. Again, the kinds of scenes you see at the wall. Not many women were killed on the American side in the Vietnam War, but some were. Nurses were killed in helicopter crashes, for example. This lady, her name is Nancy, and her brother William was killed in the war. Nancy herself was what was called a Doughnut Dolly. That is, she was a young woman who went to Vietnam and did sort of social services for military personnel, operated stores, just kind of, you provided snacks and things like that on the base for the guys, just to kind of, remind the guys, as Nancy said, to remind the guys of home. That's what she felt she could do on the base, along with the other Doughnut Dollies, as they were called, to remind the guys of home by giving the guys just snacks and things like that, coming out and giving them snacks and talking to them, reminding them that the world they were in was not the normal world. Because for combat veterans, the world of war can come to feel like the real world, and the outside world comes to feel less real. And so this was Nancy's role in the war. But as I say, her brother was killed in the war. And she goes to the Vietnam Memorial, as does Maureen, whose photo I showed you a minute ago. And she and Maureen and others help people who come to the wall to find the names that they're looking for. This is just an overview of what happens to Nancy's brother. It's just a brief report of what happens to him, and there he is. And he was killed July 28, 1968. One of the things I saw at the wall was this this bouquet, or this arrangement of flowers, and it says, "From the American Vietnamese community, with gratefulness, we are forever indebted." And there is a community here in the United States of South Vietnamese, many of whom fled Vietnam after the war, and here is expressed that sense of gratitude, fighting for a free Vietnam. Now, although we say that the war was lost, and militarily it seems to have been a loss, and the theme continues to come up. So you have this book, American Reckoning, the Vietnam War and Our National Identity. It's not a book I actually recommend. It's very, very cynical. It's a very, very cynical book, and actually I was not able to complete it just because I thought it was just so politically motivated and so cynical. But I guess that in itself expresses something about the memory of the Vietnam War, a very cynical feeling. And I've heard Vietnam veterans at the Vietnam Wall say, look at all these names, and then say it was a waste. You have this other book here, Haunting Legacy, Vietnam and the American Presidency, from Ford to Obama. And this book just focuses on really the legacy of Vietnam and how each president wants to avoid in some way repeating the mistakes that were made in Vietnam. Now, as we've indicated, Vietnam does continue to lurk. As I've said in a different presentation, Vietnam is a kind of metaphor. And so here the soldier calls in and says, headquarters wants to know our position, but then you'll notice the grave marker says Vietnam. The point being that Iraq, Afghanistan have become a new kind of Vietnam. Here we go again with the unwinnable war. All of that is true, and yet we have to say at the same time that in the long run, even if the military war was lost, in the long run, the war of ideas, I think, will be won. Because although American strategists probably misunderstood what primarily motivated the Vietnamese fighters, the North Vietnamese Army, their Viet Cong allies, although American planners probably misunderstood that they were motivated primarily by nationalism, not primarily by communism, it is true that once that war is done, that Vietnam does become a communist country, which is to say, almost inevitably then, that it becomes an oppressive country. Religious freedom, gone. Freedom of speech, gone. Freedom of opportunity, gone. A very dysfunctional economy, etc. And it appears that Vietnam, like the few remaining communist countries in the world, is now in the process of opening to the free market, of gradually leaving communism behind. I think it will be a gradual process. But it appears that Vietnam has recognized that communism cannot lead to prosperity, and that if Vietnam wants to prosper, then it needs to be involved in the world economy. And this is symbolized by the fact that many of us have clothing that was made in Vietnam. And then here we see the Vietnamese version of Ronald McDonald. And I'm not advocating for or against food from McDonald's, but it is politically, socially significant, I think, that McDonald's has now opened even in Vietnam. And then if you look at the graph to the left there, astonishingly, really, it says that 76% of Vietnamese people, as of 2014, had a positive view of the United States. I think this is partly because Vietnam sees the United States as a counterweight to China. There's concern about the rising power of China, and so the Vietnamese see the United States as a counterweight to China. But I also think that, some of this sentiment is just a general sense of goodwill toward the United States. Vietnam veterans who go to Vietnam and then who come home, what they've told me is that the Vietnamese have gotten over the war, generally speaking. That it's a very young population and that they've sort of gotten over the war in a way that we here in the United States, we have not. What I tell Vietnam veterans is that for all of the problems associated with that war, in the long run, the ideas for which the Americans fought, right? The idea that communism cannot lead, at least at the national level, communism cannot lead to a better society. That was the central proposition that guided the American war planners. And for all of the problems associated with the war itself, misunderstandings of Vietnamese motivation, divisions at home, etc., in the long run, I think these ideas will prevail. Communism, I think, probably will fail, and Vietnam will slowly but surely join the free market system that exists in most of the world.